High on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, in the panel closest to the altar, God turns his shoulder toward the viewer and reaches both arms overhead to part light from darkness. His robe gathers at his throat in thick, corded folds. His beard falls in two distinct masses, one drawn left, one drawn right, as if something beneath the skin were pulling them apart. For nearly 5 centuries, people stood beneath this figure and read pure theology, the first act of Genesis, rendered by a sculptor who had been talked into picking up a brush he did not want. Nobody thought to ask what those folds of drapery actually depicted, because nobody suspected they depicted anything beyond drapery. In 2010, 2 neurosurgeons at Johns Hopkins traced the outline of God's neck, beard, and collar against a ventral view of the human brainstem, and the match held: the pons, the medulla oblongata, the optic chiasm, a branching pattern along the throat that corresponds, detail for detail, to the vertebral and basilar arteries. Michelangelo Buonarroti, a man with no medical license and no university training in anatomy, appears to have painted a cross-section of the human nervous system into the private chapel of the Pope and called it the face of God dividing light from darkness. It would not be the only time he did something like this. It would not even be the most daring. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Michelangelo did not want the commission. Pope Julius II offered it to him in 1508, and by his own account, relayed later to his biographer Ascanio Condivi, he tried to talk his way out of it. He considered himself a sculptor. He had spent the previous years chasing marble for Julius's own tomb, a project he cared about far more, and he told the Pope as much. Julius insisted, and Michelangelo, with no real leverage to refuse a man who could withhold the commissions that fed his workshop, gave in. Part of the pressure came from rivalry as much as piety. Julius had Donato Bramante rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica a short walk away, and Raphael frescoing the papal apartments on the floor below at almost the same moment, and later biographers, Vasari among them, floated the idea that Bramante steered the ceiling commission toward Michelangelo, hoping a sculptor unpracticed in fresco would fail publicly and clear the field for his own favorites. Whether or not the rivalry was quite that deliberate, Michelangelo worked the entire 4 years convinced that people close to the Pope wanted him to fall off the scaffold. He spent the next 4 years on his back and on his feet, standing on a curved wooden scaffold of his own design that he anchored into holes drilled near the tops of the walls rather than building it up from the floor, so that the space beneath him stayed usable for services. He painted more than 5,000 square feet of vaulted ceiling almost entirely by his own hand, with assistants reduced to grinding pigment, preparing plaster, and transferring cartoons, while he carried the brush through panel after panel. He wrote a bitter, half-joking sonnet to a friend named Giovanni da Pistoia, describing what it did to his body. Paint dripping into his beard and eyes, his stomach forced up under his chin by the angle of his neck, his spine curved into a shape he compared, with real bitterness under the humor, to a Syrian bow. None of that biography, on its own, explains how a sculptor who resented fresco work came to embed neuroanatomy into a devotional ceiling. For that, the record has to go back further, to a hospital mortuary in Florence, 2 decades before Julius ever sat for a portrait. Condivi records that as a teenager, Michelangelo was given permission by the prior of the Church of Santo Spirito, a man named Niccolò Bicchiolini, to study the corpses brought into the hospital attached to the monastery. In exchange, Michelangelo carved a wooden crucifix for the church, a work that survives today and is now attributed to him with reasonable confidence by most scholars who have examined it. This was not medical school. There was no faculty, no license, no formal curriculum, and no supervising physician standing over his shoulder, correcting his terminology. It was a teenager with a knife and an unsupervised body, learning what muscle looked like underneath skin, what a tendon did when it was cut, what the interior of a human being actually contained, at an age when most of his peers were still copying plaster casts in a workshop. Human dissection in this period sat in a strange legal and religious position, neither fully sanctioned nor fully forbidden. University medical faculties, chiefly at Bologna, had been granted narrow permission decades earlier to perform a small number of dissections a year, strictly for the training of licensed physicians, using the bodies of executed criminals. Outside that narrow channel, cutting into a corpse remained tangled up with grave robbery, with the church's discomfort over the treatment of the dead awaiting resurrection, and with a persistent suspicion that opening a body for the sake of curiosity, rather than sanctioned medical instruction, amounted to a violation rather than a study. Michelangelo's early access was, at best, an informal courtesy extended to a promising young sculptor by a sympathetic prior who valued art over protocol. At worst, by the standards some of his more conservative contemporaries would have applied to a layman handling the dead without license or purpose, it bordered on trespass. He kept at it for most of his life, long after any excuse of youthful curiosity had worn thin. Late in his career, working in Rome, he formed a friendship with the physician and anatomist Realdo Colombo, a successor to Vesalius's chair at Padua, and a man conducting some of the most advanced post-mortem investigations of the century. Colombo dedicated his treatise De Re Anatomica, published in 1559 after his own death, in terms that acknowledge his relationship with Michelangelo directly, and the two men are documented, through surviving correspondence, to have discussed anatomical findings with each other as colleagues rather than as expert and layman. By the time he painted the Sistine ceiling, then, Michelangelo was carrying nearly 40 years of anatomical observation gathered almost entirely outside any institution, absorbed through the same hands that had carved the David and would later carve the Florentine Pietà, a work he kept in his own studio and mutilated with a hammer in a fit of frustration near the end of his life. Andreas Vesalius did not publish his De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the work that would formalize European anatomical science and give it a shared visual vocabulary, until 1543, 31 years after the Sistine ceiling was finished. Thomas Willis would not publish the first systematic mapping of the brainstem and cranial nerves until 1664, more than a century after Michelangelo laid down his brush. Whatever he understood about the structure sitting beneath his hand in 1511 and 1512, he understood it before the profession that would eventually formalize it had settled on the words to describe it. Vasari, writing his own account of Michelangelo's life a few decades later, mentions the dissections only in passing, more interested in praising the resulting mastery of the human figure than in dwelling on where that mastery came from, a choice that has left later scholars piecing the anatomical record together largely from Condivi's more detailed, first-person testimony rather than from any surviving notebook of Michelangelo's own. The anatomical fluency shows up across the ceiling in places that need no overlay illustration to make the point. Between the 9 narrative panels, Michelangelo painted 20 athletic male nudes, seated in twisting, torqued positions that art historians simply call the Ignudi, figures with no fixed role in the Genesis narrative and no theological requirement to exist at all. They are there because Michelangelo wanted to paint the human body under extreme physical torsion, every muscle group visible and correctly placed under the strain of the pose, and he used the ceiling as an excuse to do it 20 times over. Later academies of art, well into the 18th century, had engraved copies of these figures printed specifically so that students could study muscular structure from them, the way a modern textbook might use a diagram. A ceiling commissioned to tell the story of Genesis became, almost as a byproduct, one of the more widely used anatomical teaching aids in Europe for the next 200 years, which says something about how far Michelangelo's understanding of the body had already outpaced the illustrated medical literature of his own century, most of which was still relying on schematic, inaccurate diagrams inherited from Galen's animal dissections, rather than direct observation of human tissue. Look closely at any one of the 20, and the torsion is almost excessive for the pose each figure is meant to be holding, a shoulder rotated further than the sitting position strictly requires, a rib cage twisted against the hips in a way no model could comfortably sustain for the hours a fresco session demanded. Michelangelo was not copying a model in front of him for most of these figures. He was drawing from a working knowledge of how the muscles under that skin actually connected to bone and extending the pose past what observation alone could have supplied. The case for what he actually painted inside the theology, rather than around it, rests on 2 pieces of published research, separated by 20 years and produced by people with no stake in Renaissance art criticism. The first came from Frank Meshberger, a physician, in an article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1990. Meshberger examined the red cloak and drapery surrounding God in the creation of Adam, the panel nearer the entrance of the chapel, the one most people picture when they hear Michelangelo's name at all. He argued that the outline of that cloak, together with the angels and the single, unidentified female figure tucked inside it, forms an anatomically precise cross-section of the human brain, viewed along the sagittal plane. The folds correspond to the sulci and gyri of the cerebral cortex, mapped with a level of specificity that surprised the physicians who first reviewed his submission for publication. A pale green scarf, draped almost carelessly across the composition, traces what he identified as the course of the vertebral artery. A single angel's leg, dangling below the lower edge of the cloak, follows the boundary of the pituitary gland precisely enough that Meshberger included the comparison as a direct visual overlay in his published figures. Brain beside cloak, structure beside structure, published in a medical journal rather than an art history quarterly, which is itself a detail worth sitting with. The second piece of research is the one that opened this account, published by Ian Sook and Raphael Tamargo, both practicing neurosurgeons, in the journal Neurosurgery in 2010. Their subject was the separation of light from darkness, the smallest panel on the ceiling, and, by the technical judgment of art historians who study Michelangelo's brushwork across the commission, the most rapidly and confidently executed. Conservators and scholars have been able to reconstruct the order in which the panels were painted by studying the giornate, the individual sections of wet plaster laid down and finished within a single working day, visible today as faint seams under raking light. That analysis shows Michelangelo worked in reverse order relative to the sequence of the Genesis story, beginning with the drunkenness of Noah near the chapel entrance, and finishing, roughly 4 years later, with the separation of light from darkness, directly above the altar. By the time he reached it, his technique had loosened considerably from the tight, deliberate handling of the earlier panels, and the giornate themselves grew larger, meaning he was completing more surface area per day, the kind of fluency that comes only after years spent solving the same physical problem over and over. Sook and Tamargo overlaid a ventral anatomical illustration of the human brainstem onto God's neck and beard in that final panel, and reported a set of correspondences that went past the range of plausible coincidence. The pons occupying the position of the beard's central mass, the medulla oblongata continuing down the line of the throat, the optic chiasm sitting at the collar, and a vascular branching pattern along the neck that tracks the vertebral and basilar arteries closely enough that their published illustrations, brainstem, and fresco set side by side are difficult to look at as anything other than deliberate. Neither study claims the certainty a physician would attach to a diagnosis, and both sets of authors say so plainly in their own papers. Some art historians who have engaged with the claims raise the same objection that gets raised against any pattern discovered retroactively inside a complex image, that the human visual system is extremely good at finding anatomy, faces, and familiar structures in ambiguous forms, a tendency with its own clinical name, and that 400 and some years of drapery painted by a sculptor who understood musculature exceptionally well will inevitably produce shapes that resemble something, given enough looking and enough willingness to find it. That skepticism deserves serious weight rather than a passing dismissal, and neither Meshberger nor Sook and Tamargo have ever claimed the art historical field has settled the question in their favor. It does not, however, fully account for the specificity of the matches in the separation of light from darkness, where the correspondence lands not on a generic organ shape but on a set of distinct named structures, arranged in their correct relative position, on a figure Michelangelo painted with unusual speed and, by that late point in the commission, unusual command of his own hand. Critics of the reading have pointed out, fairly, that Michelangelo painted draped figures elsewhere in his career, in the Medici Chapel and in unfinished sculptures like The Prisoners, without any comparable brain-shaped correspondence turning up under scrutiny, which weakens any claim that he was encoding anatomy into every fold of cloth he ever painted or carved. Proponents of the reading respond that the correspondence is not spread evenly across his output, because it was never meant to be. It appears specifically in the 2 panels devoted to the origin of human consciousness and reason, the creation of Adam and the separation of light from darkness, and nowhere else on the ceiling or in his sculpture, which is closer to what a deliberate, targeted choice would look like than what a general artistic habit would produce across an entire career. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The question worth sitting with is not whether Michelangelo could have known this anatomy. The dissection record, however informal its beginnings, answers that clearly enough. The question is why he would have hidden it inside a commission for the Pope, in the most scrutinized ceiling in Christendom, in a chapel where every cardinal in Rome would eventually stand and look up. Dissection performed outside a licensed medical faculty carried genuine risk in this period, not merely social disapproval, but the possibility of accusations tied to the desecration of the dead, a charge that could follow a sculptor as easily as anyone else working without institutional cover. there is also the world he grew up in to weigh alongside the risk. As a young teenager, before the dissections at Santo Spirito ever began, Michelangelo lived inside the household of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, surrounded at meals and in the gardens by the Neoplatonist scholars Lorenzo patronized, men like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whose central intellectual project was reconciling classical philosophy with Christian doctrine by arguing that the human intellect itself was the point of contact between the material world and the divine. Reason, in that framework, was not opposed to God. Reason was the instrument through which God's presence became legible inside a human being, the one faculty that separated a person from an animal and pointed back toward the source that had granted it. A young sculptor raised inside that household, who later spent decades studying the physical seat of thought with his own hands, arriving at a commission whose central subject is the exact moment God grants humanity its distinguishing spark, had a coherent, deeply personal reason to render that spark as literally as he understood it. Not a beam of golden light, not a dove, a brainstem, a chiasm, the physical wiring of perception and reflex, folded into the shape of the very God doing the creating. Michelangelo left the Medici household as a teenager after Lorenzo's death, and Ficino's ideas did not travel with him in the form of a manifesto he ever wrote down. They traveled with him the way a childhood language travels with a person, surfacing in decisions rather than in stated arguments, which is one reason no letter survives explaining the cloak in the creation of Adam. He would not have thought of it as a thesis requiring a footnote. He would have thought of it as simply how the scene had to look, given everything he had come to believe about where a soul actually sits inside a body. The pattern of Michelangelo working years, sometimes generations, ahead of the frameworks his contemporaries were using was not confined to the human body. In 1529, with Florence under siege by the combined forces of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Medici Pope Clement VII, the city's government appointed Michelangelo governor-general of its fortifications, placing a sculptor and painter in charge of defending the city walls. His surviving drawings for the bastions, held today in the Casa Buonarroti archive in Florence, show sharp, angular, arrow-shaped projections, extending out from the traditional round or square towers that had defended Italian cities for centuries, sketched quickly in the same confident, economical hand visible in his late figure studies. Round towers, the standard across most of medieval Italy, left defenders unable to cover the base of their own walls with crossfire, a blind spot any attacker with cannon and enough patience could eventually exploit. Michelangelo's angled points eliminated that blind spot by projecting outward at an acute angle, letting defenders on adjacent bastions fire along the wall's face rather than only straight out from it. Military historians who study the development of European fortification recognize this shape as an early instance of the angled bastion, the design principle that would later define the star fort systems, sometimes called the Tres Italienne, which spread across European military architecture over the following century as cannon made the tall, thin medieval wall increasingly obsolete against a determined siege. Michelangelo was not a military engineer by training. He drew these fortifications the same way he studied a corpse, by looking directly at a physical problem and reasoning his way to a structural solution nobody had formally described yet, in a discipline that would not be systematized until long after he had put down the pen. The work at San Miniato al Monte, where he reinforced the bell tower with hanging wool mattresses to absorb the impact of cannon fire aimed at his own artillery position, held through months of bombardment before the siege ended in betrayal rather than assault, when the mercenary captain defending Florence, Malatesta Baglioni, negotiated privately with the besiegers and opened the city. Michelangelo, who had briefly fled Florence in the months before out of fear that he personally would be assassinated as a known Republican sympathizer, returned once the city fell and went into hiding, expecting reprisal from the restored Medici government he had spent the siege helping to keep out. Pope Clement VII, a Medici himself, but unwilling to lose an artist of that stature, pardoned him and put him back to work, almost immediately, on the Medici family's own funerary chapel, the same commission Michelangelo had been carving when the fighting started, an arrangement that let the Pope keep his sculptor, while quietly overlooking the months that sculptor had spent designing walls meant to keep the Medici family out. He returned to the study of his own body once more, decades later, in a way that has since become far more widely accepted among art historians than either of the neuroanatomy readings, precisely because it required no overlay illustration to prove. Between 1536 and 1541, an older Michelangelo, well past 60, and increasingly consumed by anxiety over his own salvation, painted the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the same chapel, directly beneath the ceiling he had finished nearly a quarter-century earlier. Among the crowd of the damned and the saved, Saint Bartholomew holds the instrument of his own martyrdom in one hand and, draped over the other arm, his own flayed skin, an attribute tied to his legend since the saint was said to have been skinned alive. The face on that empty, sagging skin does not match the face of the saint holding it. It matches Michelangelo's own face, a self-portrait rendered not as a proud signature tucked into a corner of the composition, the way earlier artists sometimes worked their likeness into a crowd scene, but as discarded human tissue, hollow and formless, held at arm's length by someone else. The identification has been argued in print since at least the middle of the 20th century, based on close comparison with Michelangelo's known self-portraits and death masks, and is now accepted by most scholars who study the fresco closely. It places Michelangelo's own anatomy, quite literally the outer layer of his own body, inside a religious commission for the second time in his career, decades after the sealing, and this time with no ambiguity about intent. A man does not paint his own face onto a flayed skin by accident. By the time he painted it, Michelangelo was writing privately in his letters and poems about his fear of dying unabsolved, a preoccupation that only deepened after the death of his close friend Vittorio Colonna, a poet and reformist thinker whose circle he had joined in Rome during these same years, and whose own writing on grace and salvation clearly shaped the anguished tone of his late religious sonnets. The flayed skin has been read by scholars in that light as a confession rendered in the one material Michelangelo trusted most, the human body itself, stripped down to the outer layer that had carried him through nearly 70 years of carving, painting, and, before either of those, cutting into the dead to learn what he was actually looking at. The Last Judgment did not sit easily with everyone who saw it, and the discomfort had less to do with hidden anatomy than with the plain nudity Michelangelo painted across nearly 400 figures on a wall behind the altar of the Pope's own chapel. Critics at the time, and more forcefully after the Council of Trent tightened the Church's standards for devotional imagery in the 1560s, objected that the fresco belonged in a bathhouse rather than a place of worship. Pope Paul IV reportedly considered having the entire wall destroyed. It survived, but not untouched. In 1565, shortly after Michelangelo's death, a painter named Daniele da Volterra was commissioned to add draped cloth and fig leaves over the most exposed figures, a job so closely tied to his name that Roman gossip nicknamed him Il Bragattone, the breeches maker. Some of that overpainting remains today, layered directly on top of Michelangelo's original work, a visible record of a period that could tolerate a hidden brainstem folded into drapery far more comfortably than it could tolerate an exposed body in plain view. What these episodes together ask a viewer to reconsider is not a minor footnote but the reading of some of the most reproduced images in the history of Western art, alongside the reputation of the man who made them. The gap between the fingers of God and Adam in the creation of Adam, endlessly described in survey courses as a gap representing distance, longing, the incompleteness of a creation not yet fully touched, sits differently once the cloak surrounding both figures is read as a cross-section of a living brain. The gap stops looking like a metaphor for spiritual yearning and starts looking like a synapse, a space across which a signal has to jump before a thought can complete itself. The placement of the separation of light from darkness, the most anatomically loaded panel by Suk and Tamargo's reading, directly above the altar, at the exact point in the chapel where bread and wine are elevated during the Mass, and where Catholic doctrine holds that a physical transformation genuinely occurs, stops looking accidental as well. Michelangelo put his most confident, most anatomically explicit image at the single point in the building where the church itself was making its boldest claim about matter becoming something more than matter, a claim about physical substance changing its essential nature that a hidden brainstem, sitting quietly in the same sightline, would have made a strange kind of sense beside. A quarter-century later, on the wall facing that same altar, he put his own face on a piece of discarded skin, as if the study of the body he had begun in a hospital mortuary as a teenager, and carried into a besieged city's fortification walls in between, had never really stopped. It had only changed its subject, from the creation of Adam to his own reckoning. Visitors who walk into the chapel today, craning their necks the same way Michelangelo complained of doing for 4 straight years, tend to spend most of their time on the creation of Adam and comparatively little on the small, fast panel above the altar, partly because it is smaller and partly because it sits directly above the one part of the room where a camera is hardest to angle. That imbalance in attention is itself worth noting, since by Suk and Tamargo's argument, the panel most people glance past on their way out is the one carrying the most anatomically explicit content on the entire ceiling. None of this makes Michelangelo a secret anatomist working in defiance of his faith, and the record does not support reading it that way. It makes him something closer to a man who spent his entire working life refusing to separate the study of the body from the study of God, at a moment in European history when the institutions on both sides of that line were actively trying to keep it drawn. The formal science that would eventually describe the brainstem in the precise, named terms Suk and Tamargo used in their own paper would not exist for another 150 years. The military engineering that would eventually formalize the angled bastion into a named system of fortification would not be written down for decades after his drawings. Michelangelo did not have either vocabulary available to him. He had a knife, a mortuary, a wooden crucifix paid as tuition, a besieged city that needed walls, and 4 years on a scaffold to put what he had learned somewhere almost nobody would think to look, followed decades later by a wall where he stopped hiding and simply handed the viewer his own likeness, stripped and empty, held in someone else's hand. The debate has not closed, and it likely never will in any final sense. Art historians who specialize in Michelangelo's technical development continue to argue over how much of the ceiling's anatomical correspondence is intentional, and how much is the retrospective pattern finding of physicians primed, by training, to see anatomy wherever they look, a fair methodological concern for any interpretation built after the fact, rather than drawn from a surviving letter or notebook in the artist's own hand explaining his intent. No such letter exists for the ceiling. The Bartholomew self-portrait rests on firmer ground, accepted by consensus rather than argued from an overlay, but it raises the same underlying question without resolving it. What a man who spent his life cutting into the dead and studying the angles of cannon fire against a city wall believed he was doing when he folded that knowledge into the most sacred commissions available to an artist of his century. What survives, in every case, is the work itself, still catching the same light it caught the morning each section was unveiled, still carrying readings that took modern medicine, modern military history, and modern scholarship centuries to propose, and still cannot fully prove beyond reasonable dispute. The next time a photograph of that ceiling or that altar wall crosses a screen, the folds at God's throat and the empty skin in Bartholomew's hand are worth another look, not for what the guidebooks say they are, but for what they might have been the whole time. Somewhere between a hospital mortuary in Florence, a besieged city's cannon-facing walls, and a scaffold bent low enough to leave a permanent curve in a man's spine, an artist who never held a medical degree kept arriving at the same conclusions that 3 separate professions would each need another century or more to reach on their own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.